I'm Franny Eberhardt. I'm president of Friends, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you again. I'm going to eschew the usual lengthy introductions because there are so many folks here who will be participating, and just go quickly through the list. Our moderator will be Lisa Ackerman, and she is an internationally experienced preservationist. Our panelists from earlier in the week, and these sessions will have all been taped and will be available for people to take a look at. They've been wonderful, wonderful sessions. They are Andrew Dolkart, an architectural historian and professor and writer. Will Cook, who's an attorney with a specialty in preservation law and associated fields, also teaches. Tony Wood, who taught for many, many years and is the chronicler of New York City's preservation law and its history. We welcome Tony. We also welcome Mark Silberman, the General Counsel to the Landmarks Preservation Commission, who was so very crucial to the success. And John Shapiro, a planner who teaches at Pratt, and will have some wrap-up things to say. And I'm very happy to say that Betty Wallerstein, who led the whole shebang, is also with us on the telephone. There's one person who's not here that I'd like to recognize, and that is Jessica Lappin. She was our council member when we got the First Avenue estate redesignated, and she has a family commitment, so couldn't join us today, but sends her warm regards. And I told her we would all be thinking of her with a lot of thanks, because that really got that portion of the saga rolling again. And we are supported in this effort and many of our efforts in Yorkville by public funding through the Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, and that means Ben Kallos, who is the only person with, I think, a tie on. Oh no, Tony has a tie, and the American flag behind him. So bravo, Ben, we're glad you're here. Very grateful to you. But he is not really here, to my way of thinking anyway, as a City Council member, but as a resident of Yorkville and a lifelong Yorkville. He was born and raised in Yorkville, so that's the special place he holds on this panel. And with that, I will turn this over to our wonderful moderator, Lisa, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Franny. Thanks to everybody who's joining us today. And I have the unenviable task of trying to sum up the last 3 days of wonderful conversations very, very quickly so we can hear from all of our panelists. So if you've been with us all week, you know the robust conversation we've had. If you haven't, it's all being recorded, and you can log on to the Friends website at your leisure and hear the conversations. We started on Monday with Andrew Dolkart and really dug deeply into the cultural significance of First Avenue Estate and the environment which gave rise to why we had such an important reform in housing at the end of the 19th century and the early days of the 20th century, and why these buildings were so revolutionary. And we also, I think, kept driving home the point through all three of our previous conversations that sometimes it's not what you can see with the naked eye, but it's really very much what's behind the walls of some of these buildings that really make them groundbreaking in their day and worthy of preservation and reverence today. And I think perhaps the most interesting thing, and I'm hoping when we get to John Shapiro later, he'll pick up this theme, we really talked about the fact that these issues of affordable housing and quality of life have not gone away from the city. In many ways, here we are 100 years later, still struggling with things that were very much on people's minds as the city was growing very dynamically. And then we turn to Will Cook to learn more about the legal side of both the struggle as it played out, but also what fundamentally the preservation law is and how it plays into our understanding of land use and our vision for the cities in which we live. And then Tony Wood very deftly took us through the means by which sometimes preservation battles play out in unexpected ways, and the very interesting coalition of community groups and nonprofits that came together for a common cause. And not all of them were preservationists in the way we might define that. Many people were interested, again, in affordable housing issues, in streetscape issues, in planning for the future of the city, and what we want our streetscape to be. So we've had a very robust conversation, and we're going to hear from each of our panelists for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll have a chance for a conversation, and then of course Q&A from any of our audience members who wish to write questions into chat, and Lara Sakin is moderating that, and we will definitely see all your questions. So with that, I'm going to turn to Ben. As Franny said, a lifelong resident of the neighborhood. So what did all of this mean to you, and what do you think about today as you walk down those streets?
Yeah, I'm Council Member Ben Kallos. I have the privilege of representing the Upper East Side, East Midtown, East Harlem, and Roosevelt Island. I think I represent all of Yorkville. I want to thank the Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts and Franny Eberhard, their president, and the entire board, and all the fellow panelists, Lisa, Andrew, Will, Tony, Franny, Mark, John, Betty, and Felicia. I feel privileged to get to sit here, whether as an elected official or just a resident, and just celebrating the 30th anniversary of this decision by the Landmarks Preservation Commission is a big deal. It is hard to imagine that something that started under Jessica Lappin so very long ago would still be working through its way through the courts as recently as 2018. And I'm so grateful for Friends and others for have actually investing in this decades, if not generations long battle to protect our First Avenue estate that was built back in 1915 as some of the first purpose-built tenements for middle-class New Yorkers. I also just want to say that I wasn't the only elected official to sign on. There was Congressmember Carol Maloney, State Senator Liz Krueger, Assemblymember Rebecca Seawright, Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer, as well as countless other preservation organizations. And I guess for me, it's just, when it comes to preservation, it is an everyday fight. And just because you succeeded once doesn't mean that somebody else can't come along and undo everything that you just did. And so we were able to move forward with the first Hungarian Reformed Church, and my family, half my family came from Hungary, fleeing anti-Semitism, and the other half came from Russia. And just growing up as a Hungarian, walking past the first Hungarian Reformed Church, it's amazing to have gotten to play a role in landmarking it, as well as other buildings I've had an opportunity to testify on. And I think another key piece is just, if those with power and money could, they would remove every landmark in our city. And we actually saw them trying to decalendar almost everything that has been protected for generations with Introduction 775A. And it had this bizarre 5-year moratorium on being able to consider something once it had been decalendared, and that would have just been so bad for our city. We were able to work with Friends as a citywide leader, along with Historic District Council and others, to protect our landmarks law that was, incidentally, I think, celebrating its 50th anniversary as they tried to gut it. So what I would just say is, when it comes to preserving our neighborhood's character, it's something that we have to do both as a citywide public policy, with regards to legislation, building by building, owner by owner. And I'll just say I'm so grateful to the owners who have decided to preserve the character of the neighborhood, who have refused multi-million-dollar buyout offers to stay in the neighborhood. And we've been pushing the Landmarks Commission to start recognizing new types of landmarks, including cultural landmarks. And we're hoping that we can work with Friends to really preserve what is left of the German and Hungarian heritage of this neighborhood. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. And I think that cues up our next speaker perfectly, because as you said, there's really a wealth of elected officials that come together and can be extraordinarily helpful. But there are also city agencies whose job it is to monitor and enforce certain legislation, but they also have a very tough job sometimes balancing all of the interests of other city agencies, of their constituencies, and sometimes what's an evolving set of priorities in the city. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, because I think one constant thread throughout this entire week was really the heroic efforts the LPC went to not only I think, enforce legislation, but really go to a considerable effort to explain why the law really had anticipated having a building that might not be obvious for why it should be preserved, but also there were some interesting legal issues that I'm going to turn over to Mark to tell us about.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Friends, for hosting this. I think that, you know, the celebration of this landmark and the celebration of Friends and the community's efforts to protect it are really, you know, incredibly important and a good reminder. And I do think, and I appreciate the sort of acknowledgement of the city's commitment to preserving this, because I do think that it's important to recall and just remember briefly that, you know, the law department, Virginia Waters and Aaron Bloom and Rachel Mostyn did incredible work to protect these both complexes, but First Avenue in particular over decades. And so it's quite, you know, remarkable, their commitment. You know, chairs, Lori Beckelman and Bob Tierney, who, you know, move forward with the designations, and all the chairs in between that supported the litigation. The commissioners who really, you know, dove into a 4-year, you know, hardship process, looking at things very carefully. You know, Marjorie Perlmutter, current chair of the BSA, really deserves a shout out. She really jumped in and rolled up her sleeves and, you know, assisted me and the rest of the staff in thinking about the hardship and moving forward. And the Department of Finance was critical in helping us mount a defense. Through working with them and looking at their files, we came across some very important documents that played a critical role in some of the court's findings. So it's been, you know, it's been quite a journey. And I should note that I started at the commission in 1995. So in some ways, my entire career has been sort of, this has been part of that, that career. So I also just want to focus on why this is so important, why the litigation was so important, why the designations were so important. And you all have mentioned, you know, why the designations for cultural reasons, for housing reasons were so important. While City and Suburban certainly wasn't the first housing designation, it was a very important one. But just to give you a sense of how critical the legal issues have been, in addition to sort of that, you know, the legal support for the idea that we don't have to do buildings of fine architectural quality with exquisite ornament and that sort of thing. That's certainly something that came out of this litigation. But other things that came out of this have to do with things like the Board of Estimates' decision to cut this out was not binding on future commissions, and that owners of properties who have benefited from that sort of behavior or political calculus can't rely on that and can't use that to stymie future designations. The hardship process. This was the first litigation that really challenged the hardship process and the standards and the commission's application of those standards in depth. I mean, we, as many people know, we put together a very robust hardship resolution that looked at all sorts of things, and it turned out that was what we needed, because this was, you know, the owners of the building put up a very forceful attack on many of the standards in the landmarks law. And I would point out that I think those attacks are likely to continue over time. I think that these are the kind of things that you know, every hardship provision or determination is fact specific. So to the extent that we have future ones, you know, in the future, this will be part of that, to those attacks, and that the decisions in this case will help us defend the law in the future. And so, you know, I think that this case continues to provide support for the landmarks law, and I look forward to having further discussions with other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move to Will now. Will, you gave us a really terrific conversation on Wednesday. And so I'm sure this has been rattling around in your head ever since. And so I think, you know, any further comments that you have building on our conversation on Wednesday would be welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. It's always a privilege to be on a panel with everyone here, including many friends, and just a hat tip to the First Avenue Estate Dream Team. It's just an amazing legal advocacy story, as I mentioned a couple of days ago, and I'm very proud to have had a very tiny role in it. And the easy part, you know, writing a friend of the court brief, supporting everyone's good work. So it was absolute pleasure. One thing I have been thinking about since we spoke, and I don't want to repeat what we discussed, Lisa, on Wednesday, but having had even more time to reflect on it, I continue to be struck at how path marking a case First Avenue Estate is and has been, not just from an historic preservation landmarking point of view, but also from a legal advocacy point of view. Continue to be amazed at how ahead of its time the builders of First Avenue Estate were, and the architects who literally created, you know, sort of a state-of-the-art affordable housing complex that exceeded anything in existence at the time. And remember, First Avenue Estate was built prior to the enactment of New York City's zoning law, which was passed in 1916, which implemented a lot of the features that First Avenue Estate incorporated voluntarily on its own. So I wish I had time, or maybe one day I will. It'd be wonderful to, you know, kind of trace or to try to figure out ways that the First Avenue Estate may have influenced zoning. There's such a strong correlation, it's hard to think that it might not have. So continue to be fascinating just by the way that the building predated a massive reform in the way that land use was regulated in New York City. So that's, I think, just as background, incredibly important to recognize, and is obviously a big reason why the city landmarked the property and why it is listed in the National Register of Historic Places today. In terms of the litigation side of First Avenue Estates, it's gone on for a long time. And we talked Wednesday at how hard it is to fight a legal battle. This one was even more complicated, more time consuming, more expensive, because the legal battle was waged not only in state court, but also federal court. And because Penn Central was at stake in a way, because remember the property owners of First Avenue Estate argued that a regulatory taking had occurred, and that triggered national recognition of how important not just the building was, but what was at stake in terms of the decision of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. We also discussed, Lisa, and I believe this firmly to be true, that so much preservation law in this country is influenced by the precedent that is set in New York. And so had there been an adverse decision on the regulatory takings front, it likely would have reopened Penn Central in a harmful way. And so at least from a national perspective, that was why it was so important to defend the correct decision of the Landmarks Commission in reinstating the designation and in their meticulous application of the hardship exemption. I mean, in my mind, and I think in every lawyer's mind here and involved in the case, there was never really a colorable claim that a regulatory taking had occurred, but nevertheless, this was a long fought legal battle, and no one wanted the possibility that a court might have second guessed the city's decision. And then I guess I'll sum up with maybe some of the lessons learned, or some of the greatest lessons learned, or that I learned from my involvement in the lawsuits, is that it's important to recognize the need to protect the continued validity of local preservation laws and the decision-making of local preservation commissions. We often take for granted that these laws are set in stone, but they're constantly subject to attack. And even Penn Central. And so this was a case, I think, that caused me to wake up and, you know, remind myself that even though you might live in a city like New York that has such a well-established local preservation law and a finely tuned preservation commission, that even those decisions can come from can be under attack at any time. I've always learned this. I've learned this lesson from Tony Wood and believe it firmly, that preservationists need to be willing to enforce preservation laws and not be afraid of testing it. I know sometimes there's a tendency to maybe want to hide, you know, stick our heads in the sand and hope that the problem will go away, but laws don't mean anything if they're not enforceable. And this was a good example of the city taking a very principled stand and applying their landmarks law according to its letter and to its spirit. And that deserved to be upheld and protected.
Well, that's very well said. And I would only add to that, is that I think the beauty, and yes, it's frustrating when you're on the receiving end of a challenge to the law, but I think it's to the credit of the people who wrote the law that it allowed for the constant reevaluation, so that a law written in the 1960s can still be upheld today, because it allows elected officials, the Preservation Commission, interested parties to continue to evaluate what those priorities are. And I'm going to turn to Andrew now to really talk about the things that stand out to him most from the cultural significance and historical side.
Well, I've been involved with the battle for City and Suburban since the very, very beginning, when the 79th Street complex was endangered. And I have, there are a few things that really come to mind. First of all, as an architectural historian who's chosen to do architectural history as a tool for preservation, I think that the fight to save the two city and suburban complexes really expresses how important that is, that we understand as a way to make our case what the history of these sites are and why they are significant. So the ability to have the interpretive material there that tells us why they're important architecturally, historically, and culturally, I think is really crucial to preservation battles. And sometimes that gets overlooked, but I think that that's really important. But on top of that, I think that one of some of the takeaways from all this are, first and foremost, citizen participation. That preservation is not an elitist endeavor, that it's an endeavor of people wanting to make their neighborhoods and their environments better places in which to live. And if it weren't for Betty Wallerstein, who we're going to hear from, who this wouldn't have happened without her, or the participation of the residents of the two complexes, particularly Marie Byrne on 79th Street, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, this would never have happened. And so I think that, it's great that there are professionals in preservation, like some of the people, me and some of the other people you're going to be hearing from, but the grassroots is really crucial. I think, and also everybody working together, professionals, architectural historians, advocates, lawyers, grassroots people, everybody working together with the same goals. And I think that's a kind of secret weapon of preservation, is the commitment of so many people from different backgrounds to do it. I also think that one of the things that was really powerful for this project that we should do more often is oral history. Sharon Zane was our oral historian who was able to interview people who had grown up in City and Suburban, people that had lived there since the early 20th century. And this was incredibly significant. And I think though that of course, the other thing, and this is something I think I learned from Tony all the time, from Tony Wood, but I really learned from Betty Wallerstein, is never give up. And you know, once the Board of Estimate removed some of the properties, I think some people thought, well, that's just the way it is, but not Betty Wallerstein. You know, that was wrong, and she knew it, and she was going to fight for it. So I think that that's really important, that we should never give up. But most important, the takeaway is that cultural significance is just as important as architectural significance. And we tend to forget that because we're very visual people. And, you know, if something has a lot of ornament, you know, you really gravitate to it. And these aren't traditionally beautiful buildings, yet they are incredibly important. And I think that I give a lot of credit to the Landmarks Commission for designating and then redesignating these buildings. These were very courageous acts. But it's only been recently, really, that the Landmarks Commission has made more of a commitment to expand cultural designations. So I think that the takeaway for me is that we need to continue doing that. And also, as I said on my initial interview, is that there is so much history of housing, of progressive housing and reform housing, that has not been looked at by the Landmarks Commission. And I think it would be really important to do a sort of comprehensive look at what we still need to recognize and preserve. So those are my takeaways.
Fantastic. And I think Betty Wallerstein needs no introduction other than I did learn one very interesting thing today from her, which is that very presciently, all of the papers that involve this struggle and the battle and the different elements of it have all been archived at Avery Library at Columbia University. So I think that's a phenomenal resource. And I'm going to turn it over to Betty, because even though I said earlier in the week, none of this happens without a coalition of people. In fact, the person that you need at the center of it is Betty Wallerstein, because you have to have somebody who is assuring that nobody flags. And Betty was that person in this struggle. Betty, you're on.
Well, thank you very much. The people who were so wonderful and so magical in everything they did, and one of them, of course, is Andrew. And Andrew, one of the things I don't think that people have spoken about, and I certainly think that was very important, when we were getting nowhere with the, with the city's department, we talked about trying to get the buildings recognized, and you went to New York State. And I think, you'll remember that. And then we said, well, if New York State is recognizing it as a landmark, so what in the world is happening here in the city? What was that when you went, and what did you get at that time?
Well, we got the York Avenue estate listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and at that time you did not need active owner consent to get something listed on the National Register. Unfortunately, the state is not, the law hasn't changed, but the state has changed the way it regulates the law. And we were able to use the National Register listing as a tool to show you,
right.
Look, it's not just us crazy people saying this, that this is really, look, the state thinks these are really important.
Well, you see, that was extremely important because we could say, well, how can one group of preservation people say it's important, and then anyway. What I want to say is that this is really an amazing accomplishment of all of us. The Coalition to Save City and Suburban was formed by Helena Rosenthal and myself. We just opened the East 79th Street Neighborhood Association in 1984 because we had no bus service on York Avenue on Sundays with all the hospitals and everything. So we had a meeting, and the first people who showed up were the people who lived at City and Suburban, saying they had just gotten letters of eviction, and of course the stores. So the next meeting, I sent notices around, and we went to the church, and we almost couldn't get in, Helena and I. It was so full of people who wanted to do something. Now, Helena, so the coalition was formed, and from the very beginning, it included both of the last two of what were originally 10 buildings in the city. So those last two were always part of the coalition when we presented our paperwork. Right before we had to present, the First Avenue group was really not threatened, as were the York Avenue, and so they are still the first of the buildings on the paperwork, but they did not want to remain. They felt that they were going to be okay, and so but they have always been on there, and so we really wanted to start with City and Suburban, but Helena was talking and very interested because we had, as you pointed out, a developer who owned the newspapers, and that was be a problem. So she wanted to start with the Vanderbilt building, the Cherokee, also very, very important. But now the issue with getting, of course, Tony and I, when we wanted to get an attorney, I thought of Ed Kostikian, not that he knew anything then about preservation, but he was a leading attorney, very well liked by judges. And Tony and I, you'll remember that, Tony, and you really have been amazing. We never could have done it without Andrew and you. But you remember Mr. Kostikian said, well, he didn't really know so much about preservation. He was more interested in the tall buildings. He lived in the Sutton Place area, and he was concerned, and he was more interested if we were going to do that. And we said, well, that's important too, but we want to do this. And then he said, well, how much money do you have? Tony, you'll remember my answer because I think you kind of were looking away to see whether we were going to be thrown out at that point. And I said, Mr. Kostikian, we don't have any money, but we will get that money if you will be our attorney. And so that's how we did it, and we worked with him. But the people who helped so very, very much were Brooke Astor and Joan Davidson. They were the people who gave the money for Andrew's book. Marie Byrne, wonderful, wonderful people. The people from both of the buildings, from both of the York and First Avenue, were always, when we had street events, they were there. I was in touch with both of the people. And they really, the person who owned their building, until he died, they really were not in any trouble, and they just were part of what we were hearing. But the thing that was so very important is that why we were losing every time in court was that everyone was looking at it, except for Andrew and Lena and I and Tony, looking at it as a landmark of 14 buildings. And we couldn't get the attorney to emphasize that it was a singular landmark, and therefore you couldn't separate it. So Peter Calico wanted to throw down the whole block, but then it got to be where he was going to ask for just the 4 buildings closest to the river. And then it was going to be not 4 buildings, but one tall 80-story tower. But we never, until the very last time, we were losing all the time, until the very last time, and Kostikian said, How do you tear away part of a landmark? It's a singular landmark, and that did it. But isn't it amazing that we just couldn't get that understood before? The other issues too were that, you know, it's interesting when we talk about the buildings not being attractive. To us, they weren't. You know, we were having a little trouble with in terms of the looks of it. Although it's quite handsome after it was cleaned and everything. And we're talking now about York Avenue. But the State Department was sending architects who were coming into the country to look at architecture. We're sending them to City and Suburban. And we went through with them, and also Helena. We also had walking tours to show people what this was. And Helena was the first one to do the walking tour, and then of course Marie Byrne took over. But the State Department, I did go out that time, and there were two people, Hungarian from Hungary, and they thought it was beautiful, and they loved the courtyard. So you see, a lot of it was very interesting. We had a hard time with that one. The other thing that's so important is that just as we were starting, the Tenement Museum opened. So we had a lot of wonderful cooperation from then our elected officials, Bill Green, Roy Goodman, really all of them. And so we were able to get buses to take people to go down to see the Tenement Museum, because these buildings were called model tenements, and people were a little confused. What's model about a tenement? And the Tenement Museum had not opened yet, but they allowed us to come in and they showed us pictures of what they were going to be doing, and there's an enormous difference. And also, I don't really know about the First Avenue building, but certainly the York Avenue, the whole basement was also outfitted, and the people who were down there were the workmen. So that if you needed painting in your apartment, that painting, the painters would be able to come up and do. If you needed any other things that had to be taken care of, the whole basement was with the different people who were going to be able to fix whatever was going on, which was amazing. And then when we needed a place to meet for the walking tours to start out, where we were showing information and showing some films, they gave us a wonderful room which was air conditioned. So they, you know, certainly the other thing I wanted, I think it just went out. Oh, and of course everybody was so wonderfully helpful. We also got lucky because the developer was someone that we could talk to. He came to my house. He also went to have a meeting with the tenants. They didn't want to meet with him. But he could have, while we were waiting to be heard, he could have gone in like some have gone overnight and torn down buildings. But he didn't. And also the thing he could do right away was to get rid of the stores. They didn't have the same protection as the tenants. And I spoke with him, and we had wonderful help from Pete Granis. All of our elected officials were extremely helpful, but it was Pete, and I'm sorry, my age shows because I can't remember, but you will remember Tony and Andrew, the person who was our council member at the time.
So I'm going to, thank Betty, because we could go on and on talking, and I think you've given us a lot of information that we didn't have earlier in the week, really about the experience of being in those buildings in those years of trying to build the coalition. And I'm going to hand it over to Tony to pick up the thoughts from his conversation yesterday, as well as we're nearing the end of this conversation. And after you, we'll be turning it over to John Shapiro to talk about how this fits into the larger planning issues in the city.
Well, a lot of the points I want to make have been made, so I'm going to be very brief and hopefully save some time for Q&A. But the whole importance of citizen action and energy has been mentioned many times, and it's true. If there hadn't been a constituency to save these buildings and to use the law, they wouldn't be here today. So, I mean, in New York, it takes a city to save a landmark, and it really took so many different constituencies, so many different people and politicians, elected officials, the agency itself. So all of those things were required in order to save these buildings. I don't know if we're going to be ever putting up more statues, but if we ever have another statue, it should be for Betty Cooper Wallerstein. The real estate board might object, but it's true that, you know, no one person can save something, but sometimes without one person taking it on as a personal moral commitment, it doesn't happen. So my money for the next statue is for Betty Cooper Wallerstein. I think one of the other points that's been raised is the price of preservation is constant vigilance. If people had not stayed with this issue for decades for these buildings, they would not be there. So it's not an easy one done situation if you're truly committed to preservation. I want to underscore the point that was made about cultural landmarks and how important this was and how courageous it was for the commission, and how we're hoping that over time, you know, more and more buildings of cultural importance will end up being protected. I could mention the Walt Whitman House, but I won't. So there's still battles to be fought around advancing the full scope of the landmarks law, which I still think we haven't fully used all the powers that were brilliantly inserted into that law when it was dreamed up by the great preservationists who came before us. I want to just echo and end with Ben Kallos' comment that it's a battle. Now, the preservationists today, I guess, I don't know if they think we've won everything, and they kind of don't like us using the battle language anymore. Oh, preservation's gone beyond being a battle and a fight. Well, they're wrong. If you're pursuing preservation in New York City today, it is still a battle. And people have to be willing to be on the front lines and you know, in a sense, take a bullet for preservation. So it's, you know, we have made great accomplishments, and we should salute and celebrate those, but we are not done. The fight continues. And if we think it's just, somebody said to me the other day, why wasn't that building just normally saved? And I said, it doesn't work that way. You've got to fight to save things. A law doesn't automatically just make things happen. A law doesn't implement itself. People make it happen. So I'm going to say the battle is still on. We're delighted we're celebrating a victory, but we can't rest on our laurels because there are other battles to be fought.
Perfectly stated. John, we're going to turn to you to tell us how this fits into the bigger sets of planning issues we face in the city.
So I'm going to double down on a bunch of things that people have said, particularly Tony and Andrew. But I'll start with an added pleasure about this whole case as it unfolded is a cautionary tale for developers who would strip buildings. Even if they get the facts of this particular case wrong, the cautionary tale is out there. Which leads to the question of politics. Real estate is to New York City what cars are to Detroit. New York City egregiously, in my opinion, worships the great god of as-of-right zoning. As-of-right land use regulations. We should expect more controversy as there are more cultural designations, if not a counter-revolution about that. So I would say, one, we need to be proactive, and this goes beyond thinking of this as a site-by-site, building-by-building fight, but thinking ahead about, for cultural designations, what are the criteria? What are the guidelines? What are the self-imposed limitations or places to start as we build the precedents up? And I agree, Walt Whitman House, for one. Two, start addressing the issue of preservation of use to get out ahead of this issue. I don't think this is going to be a landmarks law discussion so much as a zoning and incentives discussion. And in that regard, I would suggest that people look to the precedent set in East Midtown where with transfer development rights from designated landmarks, as well as the National Register Tax Act incentives that the state and federal government have employed. Going to the precedent, yes, this shows that our interpretation of the landmarks law, our application of the law can grow. My thought after this was immediately, what if we were talking about the Dvorak House now, as opposed to when we did? And in addition to that building that won't be named, I'm immediately thinking about settlement houses, the Finnish co-ops in Sunset Park, a number of things that people have been talking about for a long time as significant, but aren't necessarily yet. I don't think the Finnish co-ops are, for example, recognized. And the next frontier here won't be just who built, you know, what the client was, if you will, that who lived there, but also I'm thinking of who built it, the laborers, the Italian masons, for example, but also the slaves that built Francis Tavern, the Wall of Wall Street. This leads to Andrew's point about participation and Tony's point about alliances. As we surface cultural landmarks, the question is going to become which culture, which history, which narrative? And I suggest that we need to be upfront and out front on the contrary narratives. It sounds simple when you talk about Confederate statues put up during the heyday of the KKK to intimidate people in front of courthouses. It gets a little bit more complex, let's say with Columbus, the Statue of Columbus, which on the one hand seems to celebrate the torture and decimation of indigenous people, but on the other hand was meant to be a celebration of how Italian immigrants were no longer treated as third-class citizens. But what happens when we revisit buildings like Trinity Church, which was built by slaves? And this leads, I think, to the next frontier for the preservation world to become more inclusive and more participatory, disproportionate to the way it has in the past. Including trying harder to recruit populations that are not yet entering the field of preservation in any great number or significant, or in a significant way. And also look to what the compromises might be. You know, we know about the compromises regarding millions with windows, about a brownstone or row house district, let's say in working class Sunset Park versus the same type of row house district in lower Manhattan. But there'll be, as we do these cultural designations, there are going to be different types of compromises, different types of sensitivities to look at that are non-architectural. For example, the slave market that's underneath the luxury condo building on Wall Street. If we interpreted that in a place matters way, what would the condo residents and owners think about that? Having their building celebrated for its dark history. I shouldn't say celebrated, recognized for its dark history. And then the last frontier here, I think, has to do with placemaking, which is how we look at the public realm. The traditional way of saying what's visible from the street, so much of what we'll be designating from a cultural landmark point of view will be invisible from the street. There's a way to engage people through placemaking, what we do in the public realm, on the sidewalk, in front of the building, making the invisible visible. And I think this is a whole new area for research, for thinking, and again, that New York City should lead the way.
Well, that's great. And I'm gonna stop you there, not because I don't want to continue the conversation, but I know that a few panelists have a hard stop. And so I want all the panelists to unmute themselves. You know, I think, you know, starting with Ben and Mark, who were the first two speakers, you know, any thoughts about all of this, and particularly John's comments about what the future frontiers might be?
I really appreciate the acknowledgement of the battle, and just there are countless examples of my district where we fought and won preservation, and then a couple of years later the community thought they had won, and then the developer came by, gave money and what have you, and then all of a sudden a park disappears. And so I think the call to action is that this is more important than ever. I think John Shapiro was just talking about the finance, insurance, real estate as being the biggest industries in our city, especially with the home to Wall Street. And when I got elected, and I think the thing I've always tried to admit, I'm not sure I got a chance to admit it here, I just grew up here. I never thought of myself as a preservationist. I just got elected, and it turned out I cared more about this than any of my colleagues. which scares me because this should be something more people care about. And so I'm literally just doing my best here, but just I don't think that money should have an influence on how elected officials make their decisions. And so one of the things we did change with a vote of the people and a law I authored is the campaign finance system. And so in 2021, a majority of the city council is going to come up for election. All the borough presidents, all the way to the mayor, and the mayor makes the appointments to LPC, to city planning. And so we have a huge opportunity to ask people who are running not to take real estate money because of the corrupting influence that it might have. The new system allows people to run on small dollars only. And we're on a precipice, I'm very hopeful of it, that even if folks may have been tainted and corrupted on their way up to mayor, that we can elect a new class of council members, hopefully people who haven't already been in government, who will be preservationists. And I guess what I'm most hopeful for is that everyone on this call, all the panelists, will start asking their elected officials and asking their candidates to not take money from real estate. And listen, if somebody disagrees with me and doesn't do what I want, I can live with that. I just can't live with them taking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from the other side and then telling me that they made an unbiased decision. So I think that is an opportunity that we all have. And there's a pendulum, and I think it's only going to swing further towards development in the wake of this pandemic.
Well, those of us who are preservationists will hope that that swing of the pendulum is short. But you proved one thing. I always say everybody is a preservationist. They just don't know it. And I think sometimes it takes a startling case like this to make everybody start looking at the streetscape a little differently. Mark, any comments from you?
Sure. I have just a couple of comments. First of all, I appreciate the sentiment and don't disagree that preservation can be and probably is always a battle of some sorts, and that people need to be vigilant and people have to be willing to push. I do just remind everybody that, regardless of what happens in this election, the current administration has been very successful in tilting the balance and the character of the federal courts in a very negative way. And that ultimately judges decide cases, and judges, we have to be cognizant of a conservative, anti-regulation, anti-landmarking, anti-social program thing happening in the courts that that has to sort of inform decisions about how we move forward. And it's just something to keep in mind. And with respect to cultural landmarks, I think sometimes it's frustrating for me to listen to the idea that somehow cultural landmarks are new. The commission, of course, has always done cultural landmarks since the very beginning. That doesn't mean it can't do a better job. And certainly, Chair Sarah Carroll, as all you know, has very much made this a commitment to try to look at how we tell the stories of all New Yorkers, how we put all sorts of histories into designation reports, so that these reports and designations truly do reflect a broad experience of people and history in New York City. I think, though, that as John was saying, ultimately, we also have to look at how do the standards work? How can they be changed? How can they be adapted or interpreted? But ultimately, there are standards, and ultimately, there are the commission has to sort of have something to hang its hat on and a regulation that works. And those are things that we are continually thinking about. I can promise you, these are ongoing discussions that happen all the time, perpetually, since as long as I've been at the commission. How to do this in a good, responsible way, and in a way that protects the landmarks law. So with all of those thoughts, I'll turn it over to other panelists. Thank you very much for inviting me and allowing my participation.
That's great. We promised a couple of audience questions, and just because I'm mindful of the time, I want to pose one of the questions that's come from the audience, which is, how do you see the current concern about climate change and environmental resiliency affecting, planning and landmarks decisions going forward?
Is that directed to me, Lisa?
To anyone who wants to answer it. But Mark, if you want to jump in, I'm, happy to have the answer.
No, I'll just say that it's something that we're very mindful of. I think at this point, it's more of a regulatory issue than a designation issue, though it certainly will surface as a designation issue depending on where a building is located. I think that, Lisa Kerstavage and Corey Harala at the commission are very involved in this issue. And it's really going to be about how to adapt these buildings and how historic buildings can contribute to slowing climate change and adapting to climate change. So these are regulatory issues that we've dealt with solar panels, energy efficient windows, things like that do challenge sort of old ways of thinking about these things. So I think it will continue to pose serious and interesting issues about how to preserve buildings with these broader social goals in mind.
Great. Well, I know John, John raised the question that, we're still using all the battle terminology. And I think many people in the field have tried to move away from that, but often it does still come down to feeling like you're struggling. And I think your comments about Mark's comments about how we move forward with resiliency issues. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we are all in this together. It's about the environment of the city in which we live, which is surrounded by water. So, we have to pay attention to what's happening environmentally. And I think, Laura, do you have a couple of other audience questions to pose?
Hi, yes, I do. And before I start that, as always, I'm going to ask people to turn their videos on as we finish this. We had over 60 people here with us today, and we have a couple of interesting questions, but there are specifically two questions that I think will be good to end this discussion. And one of them goes back to the cultural landmarking and how the law and the commission in the case of New York City can weigh significance when it is intangible.
Well, I don't want to take up all the oxygen here, so someone else should jump in here. I think that this is sort of a little bit what I was referring to. I think that ultimately it's hard for the Landmarks Commission to designate and regulate something that doesn't have some sort of physical connection to what the experience is. And so I do think that it's hard. These are so I don't know the answer to the question. I think it's something that at the end of the day, we are a regulatory agency. And if we're not a regulatory agency, then we can't protect something. And so that's I think is sort of the push and pull.
Yeah, I was just gonna second what Mark is saying. I mean, currently, historic preservation law is not set up to regulate purely intangible qualities. There has to be some sort of physical element, and I would argue that it's possible, and indeed happens every day, to use National Register criteria and local landmark criteria like New York City already has in place to designate places that also have a cultural heritage component. The only cities right now that are sort of testing the waters about purely intangible qualities would be San Francisco, which is working to protect legacy businesses through a voluntary incentive program. And Seattle has just started the process of inventorying, again, legacy businesses that have this, cultural heritage side to them. But, currently, historic preservation laws in our cities are not geared solely to protect cultural heritage. There does have to be a physical element to it. Doesn't mean that physical component has to be architecturally significant, but there has to be some tangible aspect to the landmark.
There has to be a there, but the fact,
Yes.
the fact that something still exists often is enough to then convey the memory and make real what's inside that you can't see because there's aluminum siding on the outside. So I
Right.
think there's a lot to be said for the ability of a site, even if it doesn't look the way it looked when the landmark figure lived there, to convey and be that bridge over time and convey meaning. So I think that, to me, I think the regulatory piece, I respectfully feel that's not the big problem here. I think if it's there, if it can convey meaning to those who go by it, even if you have to have some knowledge about what you're looking at, I think there's some very important things we can do. But obviously, we're not talking about landmarking things that aren't there. So there's got to be a there.
Yeah, that's a perfect clarification, and preservation regulation can be used to protect sites, absolutely, without buildings.
Well, and I think John Shapiro wrote into the chat that for everyone to see that, you know, we also have to remember that we have other tools at our disposal. And I think, you know, that's one great lesson I think that, you know, I learned, admittedly, when I was John's student at Pratt, but you know, that preservationists often self-isolate. When in fact, you know, the importance is remembering that this is really all part of environmental issues. And it's not just about a singular building or a singular historic place, it's how it fits into a larger landscape. And so we often get bogged down in that battle of we're saving one building, but really at the end of the day, what we're saving is an environment. And I think that's what's interesting about the rising interests in, you know, resiliency of cities is that, you know, we're going to lose buildings, we're going to lose historic sites, we're going to regret at some moment in time, either that was something that was saved or that it wasn't saved. And I think we're constantly learning that our history is so layered that what we're really trying to do is provide the framework so the fullest story can be told, as well as the best living experience in the here and now. And I think that this has been a very instructive week because we've had this opportunity to go in depth into cultural significance, the legal issues, community engagement, and then today, probably not having enough time to have the full conversation we want to have, but it's certainly been enlightening and opens up the door to so many other topics. I'm going to turn to Laura one last time to see if we missed any questions from the audience that didn't get answered in the course of our conversation.
I think that a good question to be the last question of this wonderful week that we had is that, does preservation advocacy end after the building's saved?
God, no. I mean, it's only saved if you continually have people who are, that's why you have Friends of the Upper East Side, that's why you have neighborhood groups. There needs to be constant vigilance. The landmarks law appropriately allows change, but that needs to involve a process. People have to continue to care. They have to continue to be involved. So, you know, the landmarking is almost, maybe it's not the big, it's certainly not the end, but, you know, constant engagement and paying attention, I think, is critical. I want to end with one last comment on the battle metaphor. People are mistaking a battle to always be having to be on the defensive. And too often preservation is on the defensive. But other ways to win battle is to be proactive on the offensive, trying to improve your position. And I think that's what John and others were talking about. We need to be proactive. We need to get ahead of some of these issues. We have to use more than just the landmarks toolbox to achieve that. So I think, I guess maybe the better metaphor is the fight continues, and we need to be continually creative about the type of tools we use or new tools we can invent.
Well, one tool that I hope we're going to have is that Friends is going to come up with another topic that we can break into a 3 or 4 part series, and that we can all reconvene maybe on Zoom, maybe in person, who knows. And I'm really going to thank everybody who was with us all 4 days, because you are extraordinary people. And for the people who were with us today, big thanks for giving up part of your Friday with us. And it's really been a delight to have this conversation ongoing. And I am going to, I think, turn it back to Franny to say one last goodbye to everybody and wish you all a happy weekend.
I think Lisa has done it. Much gratitude to all of you for this very provocative series of 4 days, and Tony's charge to keep going, and I know we will. And with a wonderful band of folks who've been with us, I look forward to the next effort, the next effort to protect our city and our neighborhoods. Thank you all very much.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you.